All right, so we're going on a little more detail today about race relations in the 1950s, 1960s, also the space age, and the Kennedy administration. The incident at Central High in 1957, segregation, integration, Montgomery bus boycott, Sputnik, NASA, John F. Kennedy, Richard M. Nixon, Martin Luther King, the New Frontier, Kennedy's domestic reform program, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the atmospheric test ban treaty. It into Lyndon Johnson, the War on Poverty, the Civil Rights Act. Now, the Supreme Court makes a ruling. It's the law of the land. That is, they are the last word in constitutionality. The Supreme Court's orders must be obeyed. And what overturn that is with the Supreme Court overruling itself or a constitutional amendment. And the Supreme Court rule of 1954 in Brown v. Board of Education was quite clear. Segregation was illegal, unconstitutional, it must end. But what it meant was undoing generations of a white supremacist system. It was most notably in the South, but it was also directed in other parts of the country. The South had to come to terms with its racial past. And so there's been a couple of school districts in the South that had desegregated peacefully, including in Arkansas. When it came to Little Rock, the capital of Arkansas, it was another matter. Because it was the state capital, it had legislators coming in from all over the state, and so they had paid a lot of attention to what was going on in Little Rock. Central High School was at that time, the biggest high school in the state. It's a huge school, some of the finest facilities in the state. It's still in operation today. In fact, it's the only school in the country where the National Park Service conducts tours on site. So, everybody went on during the Central High crisis. But it comes down to this guy, Orville Faubus. See, when he became governor in 1954, segregation issue, he had not made segregation an issue, but the thing about Faubus was he was an opportunist. That's basically, he just kind of drifted the wind, and his legislators and other Southern governors pressured him. For long, he became the poster child for segregation. So here's what happened. The Little Rock School Board had been working with the African American leaders of the community for some time, trying to find a way to peacefully desegregate. Slow, subtle process. And ultimately they decided that 9 school children from around the area would attend, start the segregation process by attending Central High. Actually, I worked with local NAACP. Daisy Bates, who was the leader of the Civil Rights Movement, has a street named after her and her husband. She's also a newspaper publisher. Helped kind of coordinate between the school board and the families. It looks like everything's going to go off without a hitch. But then Faubus steps in and said, no, desegregation's not going to happen. So they called out the National Guard, called out 270 armed troops to turn back 9 children from going to school. They're 14, 15, 16 years old. They're children. And they have guns pointed at these kids to make sure they don't go to school that their parents' tax dollars have paid for. What ends up happening was a federal judge then ordered the National Guard to step aside And a mob of 500 whites then gathered around the school to prevent segregation. So there are catcalls, screams, students getting pushed around, spit on. Actually, these are grown adults doing this to kids. So this gets the attention of President Eisenhower, who then steps in and ordered 1,000 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne come in to protect the school, break up the mob, and allow these 9 children to attend classes. They had to do the process was nationalize the National Guard, basically put it directly under his command, ordering them to step aside, ordering paratroopers in. And all this for 9 kids. Well, the students went in, and so there was some tension surrounding the year. What ends up happening with a lot of these desegregation attempts was there were U.S. Marshals protecting these students each and every day. Basically, they had to have armed guards for protection. So one of the students graduating that year is a man named Ernest Green, one of they called the Little Rock Nine. One of the 9 students attended. But ended up being a Deputy Secretary of Labor under President Carter in the 1970s. He had a very impressive career. Actually came and spoke at the college here about a year or two ago. Very nice man. But the Little Rock segregation crisis wasn't over yet. So the federal judge stepped in, the Army stepped in. So what ends up happening is white, mostly conservative voters in Little Rock voted to close the schools in 1958 rather than let desegregation continue. We're going to have white and black children going to school together. They're going to close the schools altogether. So the Little Rock High class of 1959 never graduated. And this was, this response in Little Rock wasn't unusual. What ended up happening was, in Little Rock, 9 out of 10 white students ended up re-registering in other neighboring districts, in the suburban districts. Others went to private schools. In fact, what the Little Rock School Board did was they ended up leasing out the school buildings to private schools. And those private schools admitted only white kids. Half the black students weren't able to re-register at all, and their schooling ended at that point. There are other incidents like this. 1956, Mansfield, Texas, just south of Fort Worth. White students opposed the desegregation order of Mansfield High School. Governor at that time, Alan Shivers, ordered in the Texas Rangers to preserve order of the police agency. Violence was avoided, but mobs kept desegregation from occurring. That is, African American students were so intimidated by the sight they decided not to attend. But in Tennessee, the governor there refused to let white opposition to segregation thwart segregation in his state, and he ordered in the Tennessee National Guard in while the schools were desegregated. So in this case, unlike Faubus, in Tennessee, the National Guard was used to protect students. 1958-59 school year, the entire state of Virginia closed their public schools rather than let desegregation continue. Now other states and districts, municipalities across the South followed suit. So this led to what moderates called the Save Our Schools campaigns. Concerned parents and community members rising up saying, look, this is going too far. Desegregation is the law of the land. All this hate is destroying the future of our children. We cannot have a system where we're shutting down schools, blocking their future, just because they don't like the skin color of some other little kid. So we have to save our schools. So these campaigns forced schools to reopen, protect the education of their children. So after that one school year in Little Rock called the Lost Year, schools did reopen in Little Rock, segregated. Now Eisenhower proposed the Civil Rights Bill in 1957, which was watered down by Southern conservatives, but did establish a permanent Civil Rights Commission. The Civil Rights Act passed in 1960 intended to strengthen minority voting rights, but had very limited success. And there's a difference between desegregation and integration. Segregation means simply to end segregation. Integration means to actively bring the community together. Now, desegregation was the primary focus of federal rulings and school districts in the 1950s and 1960s, simply ending desegregation, simply opening the doors for minority school children. Integration was focused in the 1970s and 1980s. Because remember, what's happened in these neighborhoods over the past several decades at this point? Housing discrimination. African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, all non-whites basically were told you cannot rent or buy in these certain neighborhoods. In fact, banks had policies that were called redlining. Basically, they would not loan money or rent or allow people to buy houses in one certain side of town, or basically drawing a big red line on the city map. So what ended up happening is all minorities in a particular city across the South was basically forced into one small, narrow neighborhood. But if you got schools set up on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, it means you're going to have all white schools and all black schools, all Hispanic schools, because of patterns of housing discrimination. They're told you can basically only live in this neighborhood. So the process trying to move just from this, just leaving the doors open, to this, trying to reverse decades of housing discrimination, will be a very difficult process, because understand what's happened here. Separate but equal was never put into place. You had black schools, you had white schools, but white schools got the best of everything. Teachers were paid more, had nice school buildings, new school books, the best equipment. Black schools got diddly squat. Teachers were paid less, rooms were overcrowded, books, if they had any, usually the 10-year-old hand-me-downs from the white schools, very poor equipment. Well, what made the situation worse in the South was they had to have, in every school district, they had to have basically two of everything. One set of everything for the whites, one set of everything for minorities. Two sets of schools. If I go down the road here, Washington Middle School, it was built as the black high school. But at the expense of basically having to have two of everything. So, in the meantime, late 1940s, early 1950s, there have been some lawsuits. One which teachers were given, black and white teachers were given equal pay. But you go into the depths of the problem, like the 1920s, 1930s, you'd have like white school districts being being given 5, 6 to 10 times the funding of an African American district. In the mid-1950s, Mississippi came out with what called the school equalization laws, basically trying to avoid desegregation by trying to increase funding for African American school districts. Federal court said, too little, too late. Said, separation, by its very definition, is discriminatory. All students must be allowed to attend the same school. So, integration, trying to bring these districts together. Because, suppose you have a school district, it's, say, to start the numbers, 1/3 white, 1/3 black, 1/3 Hispanic. So, in general, more or less, without any housing discrimination, all things being equal, every school should be about roughly 1/3 white, 1/3 black, 1/3 Hispanic, give or take a little bit. So integration, they're trying to bring that measure back into balance. They're trying to unskew the distortion that the housing discrimination had played. So the solution to that was what they called busing. What I started doing was ordering kids from one neighborhood to go to school, be bused into school in another neighborhood. White kids going to black schools, black kids going to white schools. So, even though desegregation had been achieved largely in many districts, in fact, there are districts all of the South are still under court order desegregation orders. Still have to be reviewed by federal courts. In fact, attempts to try to consolidate school districts in Arkansas usually have to go through federal judges first because they're under desegregation orders decades later. So to bring minorities into higher quality schools in white neighborhoods, children had to be brought in from across town. What ended up happening was, with busing, there was a dramatic increase in racial tensions across many communities. African Americans were resentful of having to be bused across town. White residents were angry at having large numbers of minorities being brought into their neighborhoods. There's this peculiar sociology taking place that residents in neighborhoods had a certain kind of sense of ownership over their neighborhood, their schools, and so forth. And so racism, coupled with the fears of mistrust of other races that feeds into racism, that not have been ordinarily present beforehand, suddenly thrust to the surface. So what you end up seeing, especially in a lot of northern neighborhoods, was a lot of latent racism. That is, whites suddenly being confronted with minorities, suddenly they had to confront their feelings about that. Usually those feelings were not very good. Give an example of kind of how this works. Comedian and civil rights activist Dick Gregory once described the difference between race in the North and race in the South. He said, in the South they don't care how close you get as long as you don't get too big. In the North they don't care how big you get as long as you don't get too close. Essentially in the South it was institutionalized. That is, blacks and whites could work together as long as it was understood that minorities would always be in a subservient position. They could never be equals or superior to a white man. In the North, it is segregation by fact. Just simply, whites are over here, minorities are over there. The thing was the two should meet. That's what they felt. But now, that unnatural division that had built between the two is now broken down. They had to confront it. what ended up happening was a lot of violence in a lot of cases. South Boston, 1974. Federal courts ordered that neighborhood, schools in that neighborhood to be segregated, actually integrated through busing. So you had African Americans being bused into a blue-collar white neighborhood in South Boston. What ended up happening was riots broke out. Dozens of students and neighborhood residents are hurt. Basically, you had grown adults attacking school buses because they didn't like the skin color of the children in that bus. Police were brought in, very tense few days, things settled down, but getting to the 1975 school year, busing was again used to achieve integration. Tensions existed in other communities as thousands of students were bused to other schools, but 1999, the Boston School Board voted to end busing because integration had been largely achieved. Like I said, minority children are attending Boston schools throughout the city in a large percentage, but only because racial tensions indicate the inner city led many middle and upper class whites to leave the community altogether. It all came known rather diversely in the 1970s as white flight. There's large numbers of whites leaving these inner cities, leaving these neighborhoods, and going out to the suburbs that were mostly, if not all, white. And this is leading to the decline of a lot of large cities across the country in the 1970s. It also means the growth of a lot of different, suburbs as well. Like I said, go to Dallas, think of large numbers of whites leaving Dallas for suburbs like Plano and Richardson, all very upper class, all very white neighborhoods. Little Rock, people left the city to go to suburbs there. West Rock, Denton, Lone Oak, Jacksonville, places like that, again, leaving the area, moving out very quickly. They keep moving out to Parker's Chapel. But, so basically, the percentages balanced out because you had a lot of whites who simply left. But even though integration and desegregation was achieved in these communities, unfortunately a lot of the racist attitudes around it never stopped. Let's get to the Montgomery bus boycott here. It sparked from an incident on December 1st, 1955. Rosa Parks. She was a seamstress and secretary for the local NAACP. She's arrested for riding a Montgomery, Alabama city bus for refusing to give up her seat to a white man. Next, that was the law in the South. Segregated seating. That is, whites would sit closest to the front, closest to the door. African Americans would be sitting towards the back of the bus, furthest away from it. And as seating filled in white, moving in towards the front, well, African Americans eventually have to get up, they have to stand up. That is, they would have to give up, that is, African Americans would have to give up their seats to white passengers. And it wouldn't matter, suppose, an African American woman, 9 months pregnant, about to give birth at any time, maybe on your bus ride to the hospital. You'd still have to give up your seat to a white man by law, or be arrested for it. Now, custom and manners dictates that if you're a man, you give up your seat to a lady, but not the segregated South. Here, that's terms here. A woman has to give up her seat to a man. Well, this was the spark that local civil rights activists have been waiting for. And so they've been trying to find some kind of protest to rally around for some time. And so Parks was arrested. She's released. And so there have been other attempts like this, women arrested for refusing to give up their seat to white men on buses before, but nothing really come of it before. So that's where this man comes from. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., local preacher in Montgomery, originally from Georgia. And he's called on to lead a boycott of local buses, which depended on African American patronage. Because with city buses that operate carefully, they had to make a profit. They had to depend on black ridership. So basically, he's organizing the entire African American community in Montgomery simply not to ride the bus. Well, initially, he asked that seating be offered on a first-come, first-served basis, but as the protests continued and protests suffered from harassment and violence, he called for full integration of the bus system. Now, King relied on the system of passive resistance. It says, mastered by Mahatma Gandhi, the Indian independence leader of the 1930s and 1940s. But King retooled it and mastered it for his own protests. As a Christian preacher, and Martin Luther King believed in the idea, turn the other cheek, love thy neighbor, love those who hate you. In fact, he'd often said in some of his speeches that hate was too terrible a burden to bear, that he preferred the power of love. He also said, those who in times of moral crisis remain neutral. So all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men in times of moral crisis to do nothing. All it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. But there's also a practical aspect of passive resistance, too. Suppose you're in a civil rights protest, 1960, Montgomery, Alabama, Birmingham, wherever else. Suppose you fight back, what's going to happen? You go in jail? Probably going to kill you in jail. All sorts of cases of civil rights leaders just simply disappearing. Murders, houses being burned down, being beaten to death in jail, or what they said on the reports, shot while trying to escape. Basically, passive resistance. Not only his way of showing the morality of the civil rights movement is simply not fighting back. It's a way of saving their lives. But during the bus boycott, an effective carpool system was set up. A lot of African American patrons simply walked. And through his boycott, through his leadership of Dr. King, the boycott stayed together. And eventually, they got the case going all the way up to the Supreme Court. 1956. The Supreme Court ruled the segregated bus system in Montgomery, Alabama was unconstitutional. King gave King a tremendous victory, and he slowly worked to dismantle segregation in the South. But now we get to the space race. Here's Sputnik, 1957. October 4th, 1957, the Cold War reached the heavens. Soviets launched the first artificial satellite into orbit called Sputnik, which from Russian roughly means companion or fellow Earth traveler. Essentially, it's about the size of a basketball. this round little radio transmitter basically hurtling in orbit, just a steady beep as it went along. Well, the launch horrified Americans. The Soviets could now place objects in orbit. Maybe figuring the next step would be nuclear missiles or the conquest of outer space by communists. In November, the Soviets launched a capsule carrying a dog, proving that animals could survive space flight. But unfortunately, they had no way of bringing the satellite back down, and the dog died in orbit. Well, these events led Eisenhower to call for rapid expansion of American space exploration efforts and science education. In 1958, NASA is formed as a result, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Like I say, since 1958, NASA has led America's space exploration efforts. Putting men in orbit by the early 1960s, man on the moon by 1969, space shuttle mission, space station, and launching satellites out to the far corners of the solar system. Most recently, this summer, they had the space probe reach Pluto for the first time. Now, during most of Eisenhower's presidency, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles pursued a policy called brinksmanship. It is a very aggressive policy of basically pushing the Soviets to the limit and then just pulling back at the last minute. Rapid expansion of America's nuclear arsenal. Like I said, a very aggressive, a very rapid buildup of America's defenses and very aggressive posture towards the Soviet Union, which could easily have led to war. So by brinksmanship, the absolute brink. Well, the late 1950s, however, the Eisenhower administration backed away from this. Like I said, a new leader had come to power in the Soviet Union, man named Nikita Khrushchev. Stalin had died of a massive stroke in 1953. Khrushchev took over at that time. Khrushchev, although bellicose, overly theatrical, and something of a braggart, leaned towards something of coming to an understanding of the United States. Now, Khrushchev was the type never to pass up an opportunity to try to embarrass the United States or to try to give an opportunity to try to prove the Soviets were superior to the United States. But kind of interesting, in 1959, at a visit to the United States, he engaged in a debate with Vice President Nixon over the merits of communism versus capitalism. The event took place at a home builders exhibition in California, where the latest home conveniences are being showed off, including color TV. The famous debate, which is televised, can be called the kitchen debate because the basis takes place in a model kitchen. On the same visit to the United States in 1959, Khrushchev wanted to visit Disneyland in Los Angeles, but his request was denied because of security concerns. He was a mouse to carry hard. But Ike and Khrushchev came to the realization that the two sides had to come to some sort of understanding. But as it stood in 1959, the Soviets weren't going anywhere, and America wasn't going anywhere. The only way that was going to change was through a full-scale nuclear war. I believe hundreds of millions dead. Neither side could tolerate that. That kind of war would be suicide. So they agreed to a summit meeting in 1960. They're going to meet in person. So they decided in Russia, try to discuss their differences, try to come to some sort of understanding. Chance for peace. But a snag emerged. You see, the United States has been conducting spy missions over the Soviet Union for several years using top secret U-2 aircraft. They don't really use the U-2 much anymore, but it's still, a lot of its capabilities are still top secret. U-2 is capable of flying at supersonic speeds, extremely high altitudes, and over incredible range. But the CIA had assured Eisenhower that the U.S. was in no danger of being exposed to these flights. The CIA is conducting this thing. Oh, no, don't worry, he said. These U-2 craft, they are getting us good information on what the Soviets are doing. Remember, there are no satellite photography at this time yet. Not find on Google Maps. So the CIA is telling us, yeah, we do these flights, we find out what the Soviets are doing. There's no chance these planes are going to get shot down. None at all. So they're flying too high. And say something does happen, well, the pilots are ordered to commit suicide, avoid capture, avoid interrogation. That's it. And the Soviets also couldn't find about the aircraft because U-2 is equipped with a self-destruct device. Well, guess what happens? May 1st, 1960, a pilot named Francis Gary Powers is shot down over the Soviet Union by the anti-aircraft artillery that couldn't reach the U-2. The aircraft does not self-destruct, and he's captured before he can commit suicide. So he and the plane are captured. Khrushchev plays the incident for everything it's worth. But wanting to salvage the summit, he's parading Powers on Soviet TV, but Khrushchev wants to salvage the summit, and so he gives Eisenhower a way out. He blames radical elements in the U.S. government for the flight, trying to avoid direct criticisms of Eisenhower. Basically telling the world, trying to tell the Soviets, well, Eisenhower wasn't in charge of this. It's corrupt elements within his own government launching these flights. He had no knowledge of this. Of course, the ultimate question. Khrushchev's giving you a way out. You can go with a lie and say, oh yes, I didn't order this. The CIA, they do these flights without my knowledge. And you save the peace conference. Or you can tell the truth and lose the peace conference. So what do you do in this situation? What would you do? You say lie, go along with it. It's hard to call. Well, this is what Eisenhower does. Loyal soldier, man of honor, integrity. I'm going to tell the truth. So I ordered this man in. It's my responsibility. Tells us the world, said, I ordered that flight. This is my responsibility. And so Khrushchev had no choice but to cancel the summit. So Eisenhower's admission saved Francis Gary Powers' life. He was exchanged for a Soviet spy in 1962, brought back home. But ask the next logical question. What if Eisenhower had gone along with the lie? What would that said to the Soviets and the world? Eisenhower, say one thing, maybe Eisenhower couldn't be trusted, or worse, Eisenhower wasn't the man to talk to about nuclear weapons. Eisenhower wasn't really in charge of his own government. Or worse still for the Soviets, Eisenhower has no control over his people. So no matter what agreement the Soviets make, the other elements of the American government are going to break it. So what it ended up doing in the long term was saving American integrity and giving the Soviets and Americans a chance to work together. Basically avoiding a nuclear war. So there are a lot of times during the Cold War that the U.S. and the Soviets nearly went to war with each other. We'll get to the election of 1960. The two major candidates, Republican Richard Nixon and Democratic Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, seemed to kind of initially represent the kind of bland, unadventurous politics of the 1950s. Now, Kennedy and Nixon had initially been kind of friends, but the campaign kind of put a toll on their strain of their friendship. Say, Nixon, nominated by the Republicans and vice president. Nixon had been he's better known than Kennedy because of being vice president, but he had a reputation as kind of a shady character. His critics often called him Tricky Dick. John F. Kennedy's dad, Joseph Kennedy, former chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, former ambassador to England, was a self-made tycoon on both father and son reputation, shall we say, extramarital dalliances. Though the press didn't report those rumors, those really wasn't anybody's business. Now, the elder Kennedy had groomed his son for the presidency and was financing his efforts. There's a funny story from 1958. Kennedy's reelected to the Senate, telling supporters of victory rally. He says, "I just got a telegram from my generous daddy." He says, "Dear Jack, don't buy a single more vote than necessary. I'll be damned if I pay for a landslide." But the 1960 Democratic nomination is very hard fought. By the time of the convention in July in Los Angeles, Kennedy traveled 65,000 miles across the country and visited 25 states to seek to defeat Minnesota Senator Hubert H. Humphrey for the nomination. And so he gets the nomination. In his acceptance speech, there was a speech saying that, quote, "America stood on the edge of a new frontier unknown opportunities and perils." And so his aide seized on the new frontier phrase and theme as a theme for his campaign. Basically trying to get kind of a space age feel. People excited about the space age, space exploration and so forth. So it was the future. 1960 people were excited about the future of the United States. So I'd say, what was next? We're going to come out with the future. Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas is chosen as his running mate. So Johnson agreed. But Kennedy faced problems because he was a Roman Catholic. But definitely deflected such questions of the Pope's influencing his decision-making by stating his belief in the separation of church and state. He was able to avoid the problems that Al Smith had in 1928 by invoking separation of church and state in 1960. This is also the year of the first televised presidential debates. Nixon made it a statement by agreeing to debate his less well-known opponent of the first of these debates, seen by 70 million people across the country. Kennedy had mastered the televised debates, his calm demeanor and steady responses. But Nixon, though, recovering from an illness, having a tough time, he's sweating under the hot TV lights, squinting a lot. I was kind of darting from side to side, making all these kind of a little shifty-eyed, kind of playing that Tricky Dick persona. Shifting on his leg a lot because one had been hurt. So it's uncomfortable. Like he's trying to hide something. So generally, a lot of people who saw the debates on TV generally thought that Kennedy won, but listening to debates on the radio, a lot of people felt like Nixon won. But a lot of that kind of based on who they went into the debate supporting. Well, the contrast in imagery helped propel Kennedy ahead of Nixon. And civil rights became an issue in the campaign. Democrats now had to court African American voters more aggressively to offset the loss of Southern conservatives, but this was made easier by Nixon. Nixon rebuffed a public suggestion by his running mate, Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, a junior of Massachusetts. They appointed an African American member of his cabinet. Now, at this point, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Had been arrested on minor traffic charge. Basically, what they kind of conversely call today driving while black. Basically, he's charged with speeding and sentenced to thrown in jail and sentenced to hard labor. Basically, because of who he was, civil rights worker. So Kennedy's younger brother, Robert F. Kennedy, who had been an attorney, called the Georgia governor on behalf of the campaign and asked him to release King, while Kennedy called King's wife to console her and her family. Well, King was soon released on bail, and the Kennedy campaign drew the 2 million pamphlets in the African American community to emphasize their efforts on behalf of King. And there's a very close see a picture of King on 997. See how the election turns out here on page 1006. Kennedy wins by 118,000 votes, the closest margin since 1888. Gets 49.7% of the vote. 303 electoral votes. Nixon gets 49.5%, 219 electoral votes. But Harry F. Byrd, the segregationist senator from Virginia, also championed the closing of schools to prevent segregation, was given 15 electoral votes by dissident electors in Mississippi, Alabama, and Oklahoma. Basically, they're trying to throw the election into the House of Representatives. So goes to Kennedy. At the age of 43, Kennedy was the youngest man ever elected president, the first Roman Catholic. His inaugural address, he gave a very stirring speech, setting the tone for the new frontier, when he declared, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." But Kennedy's idealism was met with a difficulty in a coalition of Southern Democratic conservatives and Northern Republicans that stymied his reform efforts. New Frontier, that's his reform platform. Kennedy also once said, "You campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose." So Kennedy had the poetry and the vision. Poetry described his vision, but didn't quite have the legislative skill to overcome this blockade of conservatives who were blocking his efforts. So this coalition had blocked his civil rights initiatives that he's pushing for civil rights laws to protect minorities, tax cut proposals, federal aid for education, health insurance for the aged, and even his efforts to create a Department of Urban Affairs to help revitalize American cities. Kennedy was able to get through the Peace Corps. Basically, a federal agency that would send out people all over the world to third world nations, send them into communities, do such everything from helping provide clean water systems, improved crops, improved shelter, schools, hospitals, building roads and bridges, all sorts of things. And so it became a very popular and very successful program around the world. Kennedy won a housing act which marked $5 billion for urban renewal and public housing programs. And he raised the minimum wage from $1 an hour to $1.25 an hour. He also won support for accelerating the space race with the Soviets. While early American efforts were mixed at best, NASA was able to meet Kennedy's 1969 deadline and landed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon on July 20, 1969. First time men ever set foot on the moon. But Kennedy faced a lot of foreign policy crises, most notably because of Cuba. 1959, Fidel Castro's communist revolutionaries seized control of Cuba, horrifying the United States. They now have a communist country 90 miles from American shores. Well, the Eisenhower administration was planning to overthrow Castro, the plan of dropping 1,500 Cuban exiles at refuge in South Florida, basically arm them, give them weapons, drop them off, basically hoping they would inspire a revolution to oust the communists. Kennedy told about this plan when he came into office in 1961, and he reluctantly agreed. The U.S. would provide air cover for the insurgents while he moved in and set up a base. But as Kennedy studied the plan more and more, he realized this plan became called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Had absolutely no chance of succeeding. He called off the airstrikes, told the exiles, said, "We're not going to go through with this." But the exiles were decided they were to go ahead with the plan anyway. Well, as a result, the exiles dropped off in the Bay of Pigs. They're quickly captured, and their revolution falters. Well, Kennedy assumed full responsibility for this. And relations between the U.S. and Cuba soured over the years. Soured. Well, in June, the Russians built the Berlin Wall, once and for all cutting off from East Germany, all of East Germany from West Berlin. And the Berlin Wall became a symbol of the Cold War and froze relations in the East and West once again. In 1962, you have the Cuban Missile Crisis. October 14, 1962, U.S. spy planes detected Soviet missile sites being constructed in Cuba. So the threat was obvious. Castro was fearful of another U.S. invasion, fearful of American assassination attempts, and there were several against him. And Khrushchev was willing to defend his new communist ally in Cuba. But with the missiles so close, just 90 miles away from American shores, they could wipe out most of the U.S. before the U.S. even knew what was happening. So the U.S. couldn't accept such a threat. Choices for America ranged between surgical airstrikes of the missile sites or a blockade of Cuba, if any more buildup of Soviet presence. Either one could spark a nuclear holocaust. So October 22nd, Kennedy announced the nation existence of missile sites, and the world held its breath for the next week as Kennedy announced his quarantine. That is, not a blockade, but he's going to block all military ships from going to Cuba and from arming these missiles. The Soviet ship, Khrushchev announced that the Soviets were going to ignore the quarantine. The Soviet ship did challenge it, but only carried food supplies, and the U.S. did fire on it. On October 23rd, a U.S. plane was shot down over Cuba on a reconnaissance mission. And then on October 24th, 5 Soviet ships armed with missiles stopped short of the quarantine line and waited. On Friday the 25th, a Soviet embassy official approached an American TV reporter with a possible offer. The Soviets would withdraw the missiles in exchange for U.S. promises not to invade Cuba. Well, Secretary of State Dean Rusk sent word the U.S. was interested, but the crisis wasn't over yet. Khrushchev then sent 2 messages for the Kremlin. One repeating the original offer that they'll withdraw the missiles in exchange for American promise not to invade Cuba. The second one offered a condition that the U.S. had to pull its missiles out of Turkey. Messages reflecting very deep divisions in the Kremlin. Now, both sides are fully convinced a war is going to happen. In fact, a lot of Kennedy's cabinet believe they weren't going to survive the weekend. Kennedy had already ordered the removal of the outdated missiles in Turkey, but on the advice of his brother Bobby, he decided to agree to the first letter and ignore the second. On Sunday, October 28th, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles, and World War III was averted. Yeah, Cuban Missile Crisis. So they agreed to pull those missiles out of Cuba. Like I said, this is probably the closest the Soviets ever came to nuclear war, probably within a matter of hours. What's made the situation even worse was the U.S. didn't realize at the time Soviet ship commanders had permission to fire their nuclear missiles without permission from Moscow. So some captain on some ship could have started World War III. On Aftermath, a hotline known as the Red Phone was installed at the White House as a direct link between Washington and Moscow. The U.S. agreed to sell Russia American surplus wheat and remove obsolete missiles from Turkey, Italy, and Britain. But Britain had its own missiles that it could use on its own. The Russians pulled their missiles from Cuba and entered into a treaty with the U.S. and UK to end nuclear testing, the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty. The 3 nuclear powers at the time, U.S., UK, and the Soviet Union, agreed they're going to end nuclear testing, that is, test detonations of nuclear weapons above ground, at sea, or in outer space. Above ground tests called the atmospheric tests. That was ratified in September 1963, but allowed underground testing to continue, which was practiced for several more decades. So we're going to stop there for now. Continue in chapter 34 and 35 for next time.